Hello, Mother here for our final night together of Christmas ghost stories. I really have enjoyed our time together and I hope you have as well. So let's get into our last story, entitled The Ghostly Christmas Gift, a story of this land and that, by F.H. Burnell, published in 1887. Some tales are best not told. Until today, with an assignment to contribute to the Christmas plain dealer staring me very hard in the face, I had held this idea of the story that I am going to tell. But in sketching the past, real and imaginative, for an incident out of which a tale and my task could be accomplished, I hit on this, the strangest story that I ever heard connected with mortal man. It didn't happen to me, for which I am glad, but I knew the man whose life was wound in with its weird incidents, whose soul was warped by the mysterious visitations taken, as he firmly believed, as penance for a revengeful act, and whose death was dramatic to a degree of mysterious atrocity. It is perhaps one of the oddities of literature in its connection with humanity that Christmas is essentially a season of ghosts. And it has always seemed an oddity to me that there should be such a lack of oddity about the typical ghost, if that is the right term and a ghost can be typical. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason why ghosts should be so commonplace. Very few of the literary and reminiscent specters with which I have been acquainted, I am glad that the connection has been no closer, have been dull, thin, and melancholy wraiths without light or mellowness, and certainly lacking anything that could be galvanized and called humor. There have been fat ghosts and jolly ghosts, if there have been any ghosts at all, and some shades or lights. There is no reason why a spirit should be libeled as a shade, that have returned their earthly smiles. At least there should be, if there are not, in considering the fact, which is unquestioned if we admit the other fact of ghostly existence, that ghosts stay out late at night, and are light of foot, jollity and variety must lurk within their airy breasts. If ever I run against a spirit and am not too startled to use my faculties, I shall, for the good of literature and verbal tales of the future, draw it out, note the peculiarity of the spectral mind, and peer through its conversation for a piece of fancy or a flash of humor. But perhaps it will be as well for a literary illusionist, and to the man or woman of imagination all is possible, to paint or pen a ghostly hood or a spectral heart better than natural acquaintance with such a ghost would serve to establish it in the records. And this notion seems most eyeable when I consider the power of such a creation and the possible weakness of the actual creation. After all, both would be airy and neither could be put under the set and austere eye of the microscope or dissected by the logical and exposing examination of your materialistic investigator. And at the present stage of the human game, a fanciful pretty is of more account than a home fact. But this is not telling my story. Having never seen a spirit myself and holding no energetic desire to see one, I can but say that I believed the story that John Fleming told me, because I believed in John Fleming. Faults he had. What man has not? But he was built on very fine mental and physical lines, and if I am deceived, it was only because he too was the victim of a morbid fever that gripped his life away, and because there were unmistakable evidences to me of the influences that wrought his ruin. We were entirely different. My life had been in town, where civilization asserts itself and claims supremacy. Of course, such habitation forces itself into the humanity it holds and surrounds. But John had been a wanderer from his youth, had seen the four corners of the world, and profited by what he had seen. I had known him as a young man when my school days were beginning, later as the brawny and bronzed lion of our small town when I was on the brink of college, and he resting restlessly between jaunts to the other end of the world. In his youth, Fleming had been a little wild, and the stories connected with him had made him the bane of the mothers of the beauties of the town and the idol of their daughters. But as far as M was concerned, nothing was seen of Fleming's wildness. I started for college and John for Liverpool via New York on the same day, and he shook hands with me most heartily as Father and I left the train when our station was reached, promising to hunt me up when he came back. "If ever I do," as he said with a ringing laugh. I finished my college work and began the more serious business that followed, but didn't see John Fleming again for 10 years. One fall evening, as I sat at my desk hard at work, a tall and spare man with bronzed and lined face and thick black hair, mustache and beard, in which the gray was coming fast, strode into my room and holding out his hand said, "How are you, my boy?" I should have known the eyes if I had not seen them, and the voice had I not heard it in 50 years. It was John Fleming, but a different John Fleming from the athletic man I had left at the little railroad station in New York State 10 years before. We shook hands heartily, he telling me how he had come from M to see me when he found out where I was from Mother. He inquired about my life and plans and left me to finish my work, I having agreed to dine and talk over old and new times next day. When he had gone to his hotel, I could not help thinking, to the great damage of my copy for the next day's paper, how much John Fleming had changed and aged and thinned. These thoughts were renewed to the damage of my sleep when I reached home. The man seemed well, but there was a settled look of melancholy in his eyes, and a corresponding ring in his voice that made me wonder more than I had wondered over anything within my recollection. What had changed John Fleming? But I slept the question into submission, rose at noon, and hurried to John Fleming's hotel for dinner, thinking perhaps that I should find him more cheerful of eye and voice, and that continued travel might have temporarily depressed him. But the man I met had the same melancholy aspect, and his manner sank deeper into me as I talked with him before dinner. There was evidently a pall of some kind on John Fleming. We lingered over dessert and the old days and characters at M. As we left the table, John said, "Finish your work and come up tonight." I told him that I couldn't get away from the office until midnight. "No matter," he said, "come then, I shall be up." I ground out the usual amount of copy and left the office at 11:30, going straight to Fleming's room. He was up and writing as though supplying the insatiable genius of the daily necromancer, always hungry for copy. As I entered, he threw down his pen and said, "My dear fellow, I am glad you are here." That star had nearly frozen me to desperation, pointing to a peculiarly bright and twinkling star that shone through the window as if asking for admission. And as I looked at the star, I was struck with the fact that it alone illuminated space. Not another ray or spot of light stood out of the dark sky. And the star was very near, very bright, and very nervous. But for the melancholy in John Fleming's voice, I should have been inclined to laugh at its peculiar appearance. There was humor in it and in me, but mine was checked by the interest and curiosity I felt in John Fleming's depression. But the star compelled attention, and after 15 minutes silent smoking and I fencing with it, I acknowledged its strange attraction and slashed the curtain between it and my eyes. "I should be glad if you could shut the cursed thing out," said Fleming as the curtain fell down, and wondering at such a remark, I glanced at the window covering and started as I saw the jagged edge of the star in deep red outline in the curtain's center. As I started, John said with more intensity than I ever associated with his voice, "Ah, you see it too! That kills the hallucination theory and proves your interest in me." All this was puzzling to me, and my blood ran colder than was its wont. The star and Fleming were evident old acquaintances, and the peculiar outline on the curtain and the stillness of the room affected me more than anything ever had affected me up to that time. At last Fleming, who had been smoking viciously at a big, strong cigar and blowing huge clouds at the star's outline, as though to cloud it out of view, said, "The cursed thing! And so it affects you too?" I said that it did, and peculiarly. "But not guiltily?" said John. I started. Guiltily? Was it the shadow or symbol of a crime? And if so, who was the victim? Surely not John Fleming. And I pondered in silence with the desire but without the energy to ask the question. And the star twinkled malevolently on. I had become sure by this time that in its twinkling there was spite, because of a constant and jerky movement. Human spite and malevolence is so thrown out, and it has always been my experience to find them more energetic than any kind attribute. My ruminations were cut short by John Fleming's sharp question. "You do not see the face?" "What face?" I asked him. He gave no answer, but the star's outline danced diabolically. At last Fleming roused himself, and with a defiant glance and shake of his fist at the outline on the curtain, and before which menace the outline seemed to waddle and fade, said, "I may as well tell you the story of my life, and of that devilish star and the more devilish face behind. Could you see the face, it would aid in substantiating my story. But you know me well enough to know that I will tell you the truth. Beside this, men make confessions to ease their souls, or minds, or what you will, and there is no easing in adding to the weight we carry. I have carried my weight for 9 years, and for the life I took at that time, my own is gradually going out." I shivered as Fleming said this. He laid his hand upon my arm and continued, "Hear me out. My act was heady and full of revenge, but no assassination. It had men's approval, but never my own. You know how I have wandered all my life, and remember the day now 10 years ago that I shook hands with you and your dead father at New York. I went straight to New York, from thence to Liverpool, and sailed from that town without a week's delay for Melbourne, Victoria. A party of us was to organize and equip an expedition for the Western Australian pearl fishing grounds, with headquarters at Perth at the head of the Swan River. The expedition started with 4 vessels and 10 of us sharing in them, crews, divers, and apparatus. But a storm knocked us all to pieces before we rounded Point Dendercastow, and of the 10 bosses and 40 sailors and divers, but 6 and 18 reached what is now Albany. The rest went down with the fishing boats. By a lucky grab, I had managed to save one of the partners from drowning. I had never seen him until he had joined us at Melbourne, and he told me his name was George Wilson. He was a Californian, strong, alert, and evidently a man who had seen and acted a great deal. I took to the man after grabbing him from the hungry Southern Pacific, and he seemed to take to me. The sailors soon found work on the upgoing pearl fishing boats, fortunate enough to have escaped the gale, and 4 of the partners decided to go up and renew their fortunes at the Pearl Oyster Banks. For myself, I had had enough of the pearls, and so I found had Wilson. At least, he asked me to join him and return to America. He showed me charts of a strip of country in South America where there was gold enough, he said, to make a score of men as rich as Monte Cristo. Would I go? Yes, if I continued to think as well of the trip as I then did. But why hadn't he gone before? He said that he had only had the chart a month. It had been given to him by an American miner who had died of Queensland fever in a Sydney hospital, and after he had invested all of his money in the pearl fishing expedition. It would take 500 lire to equip and put us on the Colombian ground where the gold was. I had the money and was satisfied with the explanation, and we hurried to Sydney and took the first Pacific steamer to San Francisco. We landed there in June, and after 9 days spent in fitting ourselves out, I supplying the cash, we took a trading steamer for Buenaventura, United States of Colombia, and after a week's lounging and outfitting started anew and over the Andes, choosing the fertile passes for a route to Santa Fe de Bogota. Another rest and another start southeasterly over the Llanos de San Juan, across the river to the strip of land 500 miles long and 300 miles wide, southeast of the Colombian and northwest of the Brazilian line, then claimed by both countries and given over to the desperados of each, or those of any land that chose to wander so far from civilization. We met plenty of hunters of gold, such as we were, on the road, and had to watch our riding and packing mules very closely. 20 days out from Bogota, we began to consult Wilson's chart and found ourselves within a few miles of our gold ground. We found the valley and old riverbed that were set down as our chief guides about the time we ran across as motley a group of prospectors as was ever gathered. There was half a score in the party, and it was led by a Chilean desperado. Such men in such callings are rare in South America. The fellow, Juan Camigo, as he was called, demanded that we join his band and tell our business. Wilson was nervously furious and, had I not held him in, would have made a fighting dash for it. But I explained to the brigand that we were engineers, employed by the Colombian government to make maps of the debatable ground for diplomatic use, assured him that we had no taste for a life on the plains with its horse and cattle stealing forays, much as it might be to our interest to join the band of such a genius as Juan Camigo. He was sinister, but let us go unwillingly. An hour out, we found that spies were on our tracks, and they dogged us for 5 days, during which I made hundreds of imaginary calculations in my voluminous notebook, used a large compass and line for alleged measurements, all the while pretending not to see the spies and ordering Wilson not to notice them. At the end of the 4th day, Camigo's dogs withdrew, and at the end of the 5th we stopped our mummery, and after riding 10 leagues as fast as our animals could carry us, found a cave and lay in hiding for a week. Then we cautiously retraced our steps, and were soon within the marks of our chart, with Camigo and his coyotes away. 3 days later, in the partially concealed depression of the valley, evidently an old stream bed, we found enough gold and nuggets to found a monarchy or corrupt the world. It was pure metal in rugged and partially shining lumps, from an ounce to several pounds in weight. In 2 days, we had divided the necessities in our pack mule's burden between us, cached the rest, and loaded the spare animal and our own with between 400 and 500 pounds of the yellow nuggets most exposed to view. On the night of December 24th, we were within 3 days' ride of Bogota, and in a wild and arid plain. It was Wilson's turn to guard and mine to sleep. At midnight, I was wakened by a shrill neigh. I glanced toward the fire, saw the pack mule saddled, and Wilson in the act of mounting his own riding animal, and with the bridle of my own in his hand. In a second, I saw that he was about to desert me with the gold, and seizing my rifle, I drew a bead on him and shot him through the back as he prepared to jump into the saddle. He never spoke a word or moved a muscle after I reached him. The shot was a killing one. Upon the blanket in which I was rolled, I found a note which jeeringly bade me goodbye and told me that I had served his purpose well. I buried him in the valley, divided the load of gold between the 2 mules, and pushed on to Bogota and thence to Buenaventura. At the latter place I boxed the gold and shipped it with myself to San Francisco, where I turned it into cash. It yielded $18,000. So much for the story of my relations with Wilson and the manner of his death. He richly deserved what he got, though I would rather have lost my own life in Colombian plains than take his. But I shot him on the impulse of the moment. The $18,000 grew and multiplied in California, and I am rich. That does not interest you. The strange part of my story remains to be told. Since the day I killed Wilson with his spirit and its symbol, that devilish star, and as he spoke the star leaped as if in laughter and grew redder, has attended me. It has come between me and those I loved and is ever present. I have never rested in its baneful presence, and each Christmas day I find upon my table a lump of gold in the form of a star, in which Wilson's features are impressed. See them." And John Fleming went to a cabinet and took from a case therein 9 shining and rough pieces of gold, each in the form of a star, and each with the features of a man sunken in them. Each of the 9 was an exact duplicate of the other. I could not resist a shudder as I saw them, and a strange thrill or concussion as from a current of electricity passed through me as I lifted one from the drawer, and the shadow of the symbolic star leaped and laughed on the curtain as though in malice at my terror. John Fleming buried his face in his hands and raised it as I put my hand on his shoulder and said that he was the victim of a trick. "Oh, no, you do not see that horrible face beyond," said he with a shudder. "It is not for other eyes than mine. The star is visible, the face is not." I ran to the window and dashed up the curtain. There hung the star in the dark sky, yet out of it, and it was the only light on that sky's front. It danced at me and threw its bloody glare on the wall, but no face was visible. I drew the curtain down again, preferring the shadow to the star itself. I was impressed against my will as to its supernatural origin, but turned up the lamps and called for more light so as to drown it. The servant saw nothing, and Fleming told me that only those he loved ever saw the star, and none but he himself the face. I bade him good night and went home to think, but not to sleep. I had hardly got to bed when I was summoned by a message from P., the night clerk at Fleming's hotel. Something was wrong with Mr. Fleming. I hurried on my clothes and ran to the hotel and upstairs to John Fleming's room. He sat at the table where I had left him, dead. In his hand was a pistol, and through his temple a bullet. The star's reflection still danced on the curtain, and its origin was still shining bloodily in front of the sky. I seemed to see the thin outline of a receding face also as I lifted the curtain, but do not know whether it was the recollection of the vision on the gold star still hanging on me. And then the star faded out, and from that day to this, I have never seen it. On the table before which all that was left of John Fleming sat 2 letters. One was addressed to me. It charged me to see that his belongings went to his sister, and that $18,000 was paid to the local hospitals. He left me his watch and the ring and the 9 golden stars. I went to the cabinet to see them. Their case was there, but they had gone. The ghostly Christmas gifts from the malevolent spirit which controlled the face and the star, and marking the Christmas tragedy upon the Columbian plains, had been taken back to that land from this. Oh, my. Well, that was an interesting story to end our time together. Again, I really have enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to perhaps doing this again next year. That is, if you enjoy it, let me know in the comments. And I would just like to take this opportunity to wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Until we meet again, have a wonderful evening.